I thought the hardest betrayal would come from a stranger. I was wrong. It came from inside my own home, from the person I trusted without question. One small decision changed everything. I forgot to tell him the security camera was working again. When I opened the app and saw what he was doing behind my back, my body froze, but my heart broke first. In that moment, I realized the danger was not just losing my home, but losing my voice, my credibility, and my right to decide my own life. And that was only the beginning. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Holloway, and I am 71 years old. I have lived long enough to know the difference between being fragile and being careful, between loneliness and solitude. People often confuse the two, especially when a woman reaches my age. I never did. I considered myself steady, organized, and fully capable of managing my own life, even after my husband passed away 6 years ago. Grief did not erase who I was. It simply made the quiet louder. I live in Savannah, Georgia, on a tree-lined street where the houses lean gently toward the past. My home is more than 80 years old, with the tall windows, creaking wooden floors, and a front porch that has seen decades of changing seasons. This house held my marriage, my career, and my years as a mother. It is where I raised my son, where I balanced household budgets late at night after long days working as a school accountant, and where I learned that discipline and order could be a form of comfort. Every room carries a memory, and I have always known exactly where everything belongs. After my husband died, people worried about me living alone. I understood their concern, but I was never afraid of the silence. I liked the predictability of my days: morning coffee by the window, careful planning of expenses, weekly grocery trips, and quiet evenings with a book. I had built a life that made sense to me, one that did not rely on anyone else to function properly. My son, Daniel Holloway, is 45 years old and my only child. I raised him largely on my own after his father worked long hours and later fell ill. Daniel was never a bad boy, just restless. He changed jobs often, chased ideas that did not always work, and struggled to settle into stability. I never judged him for that. I told myself that everyone finds their footing in their own time. A mother's role, I believed, was to support without smothering, to trust even when doubt crept in quietly. Daniel married Rachel, a woman who impressed me from the beginning. She spoke confidently, dressed well, and always knew how to say the right thing. She had a way of making people feel listened to, even when she was steering the conversation where she wanted it to go. At first, I admired that quality. I saw it as competence, not calculation. Any reservations I felt were vague and easy to dismiss. When Daniel and Rachel suggested moving in with me, it sounded reasonable. They said it would help all of us. They would save money, I would have company, and the house was large enough that we would not be in each other's way. I did not agree because I felt weak or incapable. I agreed because I believed families should take care of one another when the opportunity presents itself. I believed closeness was a blessing, not a risk. Life adjusted smoothly at first. We shared meals, exchanged small talk, and settled into routines that felt almost comforting. I told myself I had made the right decision. The house felt fuller, warmer, more alive than it had in years. I remember thinking that perhaps this was how the later chapters of life were meant to be written, quietly and together. At that time, I truly believed the hardest part of my life was already behind me. If you're still watching and already feeling that something isn't right, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. What I discovered next was small, quiet, and easy to dismiss, but it changed everything. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The security cameras had been part of the house long before Daniel and Rachel moved in. My husband installed them years ago, not because we lived in fear, but because he believed prevention was a form of responsibility. After he passed, the habit stayed with me. I liked knowing the house was watched, even if nothing ever happened. It made the walls feel solid, as if they were still standing guard when I slept. One morning, I noticed the small indicator light near the hallway camera was dark. I checked the monitor, adjusted the settings, and tried again. Nothing. It was a simple technical failure, the kind that happens when equipment ages. Still, it unsettled me. Not because I expected danger, but because disorder has always made me uneasy. I called a local technician that afternoon and scheduled a repair. It felt routine, almost forgettable. What I did not do was mention it to my son. It was not intentional. I did not hide the appointment or lower my voice when I made the call. I simply forgot. Since Daniel and Rachel had moved in, they had taken over so many daily decisions that I had grown used to things happening around me instead of through me. Groceries appeared in the pantry. Bills were sometimes paid before I even looked at them. I told myself it was helpful, that this was what shared living looked like. In that quiet adjustment, telling them about the camera slipped my mind. The technician came 2 days later while Daniel was out and Rachel was still asleep. He worked quickly, tested the system, and installed a new application on my phone so I could view the cameras remotely. When he left, everything was functioning perfectly again. I put my phone down and returned to my routine, unaware that this small oversight had quietly changed everything. Over the next few days, something subtle shifted inside the house. Daniel and Rachel were still polite, still pleasant, but there were pauses in conversations when I entered a room. Doors closed more often. Papers appeared on the dining table and disappeared just as quickly. Nothing obvious enough to accuse, nothing solid enough to question. Just a faint, persistent sense that I was no longer standing at the center of my own home. I blamed myself for noticing. I told myself I was reading too much into ordinary behavior. Aging makes you attentive in ways that are sometimes inconvenient. I reminded myself of that and let the feeling pass, or at least I tried to. Then came the afternoon when Daniel said he was going out to run errands, and Rachel mentioned she needed to stop by a store across town. Their departures were casual, unremarkable. I was alone in the house, folding laundry in the quiet, when my phone vibrated with a notification reminding me about the camera application. I stared at the screen for a long moment, debating whether to open it. There was no suspicion guiding my hand, only habit. I wanted to confirm the system was working, nothing more. I tapped the screen. The image loaded slowly, then sharpened. The living room came into view, clear and bright in the afternoon light. Daniel was standing near the coffee table. Rachel sat nearby, papers spread out in front of her. They were not dressed to leave. They were not preparing to go anywhere. They were focused, intent, moving with the ease of people who believed they were alone. My body reacted before my mind did. My fingers went cold. My breathing slowed until it felt unnatural, as if my chest had forgotten its rhythm. I did not yet understand what I was seeing, only that it contradicted everything I had been told minutes earlier. I stayed perfectly still, watching the screen, unable to look away. In that suspended moment, I realized something fundamental had shifted. Whatever was unfolding in my living room was not accidental, and it was not meant for me to witness. That was the moment I understood that the house I trusted most was no longer honest with me. If this story is starting to make you uneasy, comment number 2 below. The warning signs were there, but I tried to ignore them. In the next chapter, that mistake came at a cost I never expected. Let's continue to chapter 3. I did not move when I realized Daniel and Rachel were still in the house. My body stayed rooted where it was, my hand gripping the phone so tightly that my fingers began to ache. The shock passed quickly, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous: clarity. Whatever they were doing in my living room, they had lied to me about it without hesitation, and that alone changed the shape of everything. I forced myself to look closer instead of pulling away. The camera angle showed the coffee table clearly. Papers were spread across it in neat rows, not tossed carelessly, but arranged with purpose. A dark folder caught my attention immediately. I recognized it the way you recognize an old scar, not because you see it often, but because you remember exactly where it came from. It was mine. I kept it locked in a drawer in my bedroom desk, along with documents I had spent a lifetime protecting. Seeing that folder in Daniel's hands made my stomach tighten. He flipped through the pages as if they belonged to him, pausing now and then while Rachel leaned closer, pointing to specific sections. She held a pen and made notes on a yellow pad, her movements practiced, efficient. There was no hesitation in either of them, no sign of guilt. They behaved like people handling materials they expected to have access to. I felt a strange distance from my own emotions as I watched. There were no tears, no immediate rush of anger. Instead, a quiet awareness settled in. This was not curiosity on their part. It was not a misunderstanding or a momentary lapse in judgment. They were comfortable. That comfort told me more than any words could have. Daniel paced slowly across the room, stopping near the window, then returning to the table. His posture was familiar, the same one he used when he was concentrating as a boy, except now it felt foreign. Rachel sat upright, composed, occasionally glancing toward the hallway as if confirming their privacy. They were not afraid of being interrupted. They assumed they were alone. That assumption cut deeper than the act itself. I realized then that this was not the first time they had done this. The ease with which they handled my belongings, the lack of urgency in their movements, all suggested repetition. They had crossed this line before, and each time it had become easier. I was not a participant in whatever decisions were being made at that table. I was not even an obstacle yet. I was an absence. The realization did not break me. It rearranged me. I understood something fundamental in that moment. Love, when paired with entitlement, can rot quietly. It does not announce itself. It settles in gradually, disguising control as concern and access as affection. I had mistaken proximity for loyalty, familiarity for respect. I considered stepping into the living room then, considered asking simple questions and watching their reactions. The thought passed as quickly as it came. Confrontation would give them time to adjust, to reshape the story before I even understood its outline. I did not yet know how far this went, or how much they believed they were entitled to take. I needed to see the full picture, not just the corner they were willing to show me. So I stayed still. When they finally gathered the papers, they did not return them carefully. The folder was placed back on the table instead of the drawer it came from. A stack of documents was slid beneath a magazine, hidden in plain sight. It was careless, almost dismissive, as if the need to pretend had already begun to fade. The screen went quiet when they left the room. I lowered the phone slowly, feeling the weight of it settle into my palm. Nothing in the house had changed physically, yet everything was different. The betrayal had not arrived with noise or confrontation. It had already been living there, moving freely through my home while I believed myself safe. That was when I understood the betrayal had begun long before I ever noticed. If you're still here and wondering how deep this betrayal really goes, comment number 3 below. What I tried to do next was the most natural thing for a mother, but it only made things worse. Let's move on to chapter 4. After I lowered the phone, I returned it to the table and forced myself back into the shape of the woman my son expected to see. I did not confront Daniel or Rachel. I did not ask questions or reveal what I had witnessed. Instead, I chose stillness. I told myself that if I remained calm, if I observed quietly, whatever was happening would eventually make sense. Mothers are trained to believe patience can solve most things. Over the next few days, I moved through the house as if nothing had changed. I prepared meals, folded laundry, and kept my routines intact. On the surface, life continued without disruption. Beneath that surface, I watched everything. I noticed how Daniel reached for the mail before I did, sorting through envelopes with a speed that felt practiced. I noticed how Rachel lingered near my desk when she thought I was occupied elsewhere, asking casual questions about documents I kept there, questions framed as concern rather than curiosity. They spoke often about organization, about planning ahead, about how complicated things become when people wait too long to put their affairs in order. I listened without responding much, offering vague answers that revealed nothing. Each time I deflected, Rachel smiled politely, as if my restraint were an inconvenience rather than a boundary. I tried to steer conversations towards safer ground. I asked about Daniel's work prospects. I mentioned neighbors, community events, ordinary things meant to remind us we were a family sharing space, not adversaries negotiating territory. Daniel reassured me in ways that felt rehearsed, his tone gentle but dismissive. Rachel shifted the focus effortlessly back to health, stress, and how tiring it must be to manage everything alone at my age. The language changed subtly, then more clearly. I was no longer simply a mother. I became someone who worried too much, someone who needed rest, someone whose memory might not be as reliable as it once was. None of it was said sharply. That was the danger. Each comment landed softly, wrapped in care, making it difficult to challenge without appearing defensive. I began to feel the ground move beneath me. The issue was no longer the papers I had seen or the lies I had caught. The issue was me, or rather, the version of me they were slowly presenting as truth. A woman who needed guidance, a woman who could be persuaded for her own good, a woman whose authority could be questioned without resistance. At night, alone in my room, I replayed everything in my mind. I asked myself whether I was imagining patterns where none existed, whether grief or age had sharpened my suspicion beyond reason. The doubt crept in quietly, the way it always does when trust has been weaponized. I had no one to test my thoughts against. To speak out felt premature, even dangerous, without proof I could hold in my hands. What unsettled me most was not the possibility that I might lose control, but how efficiently they were positioning themselves to take it. Daniel moved with the confidence of someone who believed he was entitled to decide. Rachel moved with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to make that decision appear reasonable. Between them, I felt myself shrinking, not physically, but socially, as if my voice were becoming easier to overlook. I realized then that kindness alone would not stop this. Silence had bought me time, but it had also confirmed their assumption that I would not resist. Whatever was unfolding in my home was not waiting for my consent. It was progressing steadily, politely, and without pause. That was when I understood that maintaining peace was no longer the same as protecting myself. If you're still watching and sensing the tension tightening, comment number 4 below to let me know. I thought I was holding the line, but in the next chapter, the mask finally slipped. Let's continue to chapter 5. The first sign that something had shifted beyond quiet manipulation arrived in the mail. A medical appointment reminder appeared with my name printed neatly at the top. scheduled for a date I had not chosen. I stood in the kitchen holding the envelope, reading it twice, then a third time, as if repetition might reveal a mistake. It did not. The appointment was real, and it had been made without me. When I asked Daniel about it later that evening, his explanation came too quickly, polished and calm. He said it was routine, something sensible families did to stay ahead of potential problems. The words were gentle, but the action behind them was not. I felt a sharp, unmistakable sense of intrusion, as though a door inside me had been opened without permission. That night, sleep would not come. The house was quiet, but the quiet felt watchful, charged. I reached for my phone and opened the camera application again, no longer out of habit, but necessity. The screen glowed softly as the image loaded. Daniel and Rachel were in the living room, seated close together, their voices low, their posture intent. I listened without moving, my breath shallow, my body still. They spoke about assessments, about documentation, about how important it was to have records in place before things became complicated. The words were clinical, stripped of emotion. They were not discussing my well-being. They were discussing my capacity, my credibility, my usefulness as a decision maker. I understood then that they were building something deliberate, step by careful step. What frightened me most was not the strategy itself, but how ordinary it sounded to them. This was not desperation. It was planning. They were preparing to redefine me in terms that would be difficult to challenge once written down. If they succeeded, everything I said afterward could be dismissed as confusion. Every objection could be framed as evidence. The house changed after that, or perhaps my awareness of it did. Doors felt heavier. Hallways seemed narrower. I noticed how often Rachel checked her phone, how Daniel lowered his voice when I entered a room. Papers shifted locations when I was not present. I began to feel like a guest in a place I had owned for decades. Then came the moment when pretense fell away. It happened during a conversation that began politely enough. I mentioned the appointment again, this time stating clearly that I preferred to schedule my own medical care. Daniel's expression tightened before he could stop it. His patience, so carefully maintained, slipped just enough for me to see what lay beneath. Rachel did not intervene. She watched, calculating, as if gauging how much resistance I still had left. In that brief exchange, I saw it plainly. They were no longer negotiating with me. They were managing me. The realization settled heavily in my chest. I had crossed an invisible threshold. Whatever space existed between misunderstanding and intent was gone. The danger was no longer theoretical. It lived here, shared my table, spoke my name with practiced concern. I retreated to my room and closed the door, leaning against it as if it might steady me. My mind raced, not with panic, but with the clarity sharpened by fear. I thought of the papers I had seen, of the lies told so easily, of the quiet confidence with which they had assumed control. The betrayal was complete now, no longer hidden behind kindness or obligation. I understood then that trust was no longer a shield. It was a vulnerability. If they were willing to question my sanity, they were willing to erase me piece by piece, legally and socially, until resistance became impossible. As I sat alone in the dim light, one truth stood out with painful certainty. I could not afford to wait for things to become clearer. They already were. And if I was going to survive what was coming, I would need something stronger than hope, something firmer than love, to stand my ground. I spent that night sitting on the edge of my bed, the house settling around me in its familiar sounds, as if nothing inside it had changed. I did not cry. I did not panic. What I felt was heavier than fear and steadier than anger. It was the weight of understanding. Whatever Daniel and Rachel were building, it was no longer a family disagreement or a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with patience. It was a process designed to move forward whether I agreed or not. When dawn came, it brought clarity instead of relief. I walked through my options slowly, the way I once balanced ledgers at work, listing consequences instead of hopes. If I stayed silent and trusted that things would resolve themselves, I would eventually lose the right to decide anything at all. If I confronted them directly, I would give them exactly what they needed: proof that I was emotional, reactive, and unstable. Either path ended the same way, with my voice diminished and my authority erased. That left only one choice. It was not a dramatic decision, and it did not feel brave in the moment. It felt cold, almost clinical. I accepted that my role had changed. I was no longer a mother trying to preserve harmony. I was a woman protecting herself from people who believed her age made her manageable. That realization carried grief with it, but it also carried focus. I began to see their weaknesses as clearly as they saw mine. Daniel and Rachel were confident, too confident. They believed proximity gave them control, and that my reluctance to cause conflict meant I would not act. They assumed my kindness was exhaustion, and my silence was surrender. They underestimated what decades of careful thinking had taught me. Systems fail when people grow careless. I decided then that I would not alert them to the shift inside me. I would continue to move through the house as I always had. I would nod, listen, and appear agreeable. Outwardly, I would be cooperative. Inwardly, I would be precise. Every interaction became data. Every pause, every glance, every quiet decision they made when they thought I was not paying attention was something to be remembered. I did not reach for help yet. That step required preparation. What I needed first was time and composure, not allies who might act too quickly. I had learned long ago that acting before understanding the full picture could do more harm than waiting. This situation was no different. If I moved too soon, I risked confirming the version of me they were already constructing. So I chose silence, but not the kind born of fear. It was a deliberate silence, shaped carefully around intention. I let Rachel explain things she assumed I did not understand. I allowed Daniel to speak with the soft authority he believed I would accept. I made no corrections. I offered no resistance. I let them believe their plan was progressing smoothly. Inside, however, I was organizing. I separated emotion from strategy. I reminded myself that truth does not need volume to survive, only evidence and timing. Whatever came next would require both. That was the hardest part of the choice, harder even than accepting betrayal. I had to let them think they were winning. I had to listen to conversations that diminished me without reacting. I had to trust that restraint now would give me leverage later. It went against every instinct I had as a mother, but it aligned perfectly with my need to remain whole. From that moment on, nothing I did was accidental. Every word I spoke was measured, and every silence was intentional. If you're still with me and feel the weight of that decision, comment number 6 below. From here on, nothing would be accidental, and the consequences would be real. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The consequences of my silence arrived quietly, the way weather changes without announcing itself. Daniel and Rachel grew more comfortable in their authority, and that comfort translated into action. Decisions began to happen around me instead of with me. Appointments were adjusted. Plans were mentioned after they had already been made. Each change was presented as helpful, thoughtful, necessary. I let it happen. They started small. Daniel suggested I rest more, that I take fewer trips out of the house. He said it casually, as if the idea had just occurred to him, but the suggestion carried weight. Rachel followed with concern dressed as practicality, reminding me how tiring errands could be, how unpredictable traffic had become. I nodded and thanked them. I watched their relief surface briefly, then disappear as they moved on to the next adjustment. Soon, my days felt narrower. The car keys were placed somewhere I did not usually leave them. When I asked, Rachel said she had moved them for safekeeping, worried I might misplace them. I accepted the explanation and made a mental note of the drawer where they now rested. My calendar began to fill with reminders I had not written. I noticed how often I was told what time it was, what I should be doing, where I needed to be. The house itself began to feel different. Rooms that once belonged to me now felt shared, then observed. I stayed longer in my bedroom, not out of fear, but because it was the only space that still felt like mine. Even there, I was careful. I learned to keep my thoughts quiet, my expressions neutral. Any sign of frustration might be collected and stored as evidence against me. The effort required to maintain that composure was exhausting. Not physically, but mentally. Every interaction demanded awareness. Every sentence needed to be weighed. I slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound, my mind already alert, already working. It was not age that made me tired, it was vigilance. As the days passed, Daniel and Rachel grew less cautious. They spoke more freely when they believed I was occupied, their voices drifting down hallways with careless confidence. They assumed the pressure was working. They assumed my compliance meant acceptance. I heard plans referenced casually, future arrangements spoken of as if they were inevitable. The certainty in their tone told me they believed the outcome was already decided. That certainty became my advantage. I listened. I remembered. I allowed them to underestimate me because it made them predictable. Rachel began to leave papers out longer, no longer rushing to clear surfaces when I entered a room. Daniel spoke about timelines without softening his language. They believed I had adjusted to my new role, that I had accepted guidance where authority once lived. What they did not see was the cost I was paying willingly. Every small surrender was temporary. Every limitation they placed on me clarified their intentions. I could see the structure of their plan now, not in detail, but in direction. They were tightening control gradually, carefully, avoiding anything that might trigger resistance before they were ready. I did not intervene because I was afraid. I waited because I was learning. There were moments when doubt tried to resurface, when the weight of isolation pressed heavily enough to make me question my resolve. Those moments passed. I reminded myself that discomfort was not defeat. The pressure they applied was meant to weaken me, to hurry me into dependence. Instead, it sharpened my understanding. By the end of that week, I knew something important. They believed the consequences of their actions were breaking me down. In truth, those consequences were revealing the precise shape of their control, the points where it relied most on assumption rather than fact. And once I could see that clearly, I knew where to aim. There is a limit to what silence can protect. I reached it quietly, not in a moment of panic, but in the slow recognition that time was no longer neutral. Each day I waited made the story they were building more solid, more believable on paper. Control, once written down, does not need permission to continue. I understood then that endurance without direction was only delaying the inevitable. The opportunity came on an ordinary morning. Daniel and Rachel left the house together, talking about errands and schedules, their voices already moving ahead of me. When the door closed, the house exhaled. The air felt different without their presence, lighter in a way I had almost forgotten. I did not rush. I sat at the kitchen table and let the stillness return to me, grounding myself in the familiar weight of the chair, the sound of the clock, the simple fact that I was alone. I needed someone outside the gravity of family, someone whose loyalty was not shaped by blood or convenience, but by obligation and law. Friends and neighbors, as kind as they were, belonged to the same social circle Daniel and Rachel moved through. I could not risk sympathy turning into gossip, or concern becoming a warning. What I needed was distance and professionalism. I found the number quietly, written down in a notebook I kept hidden beneath old tax records. An attorney who specialized in elder law, a field I had never imagined would one day concern me. I waited until my hands were steady before I dialed. When the call connected, I kept my voice measured and calm. I did not tell a story. I asked questions. I asked about personal decision-making rights, about what it meant to give someone power over finances or medical choices. I asked about a power of attorney, carefully clarifying that it was a legal authorization allowing another person to act on someone's behalf, often used legitimately, but easily abused when placed in the wrong hands. I listened closely to the answers, committing them to memory. The message was clear. Once authority is transferred on paper, reclaiming it can be difficult, especially if questions about mental capacity have already been raised. Evidence matters. Documentation matters. Timing matters most of all. The attorney did not alarm me, but she did not soften the truth either. What I was facing was real, and it was preventable only if handled correctly. When the call ended, I remained seated for a long moment, the phone resting quietly in my hand. I did not feel relief. Relief suggests the danger has passed. What I felt instead was balance. The ground beneath me felt steadier, not because the threat was gone, but because I was no longer navigating it blind. For the first time since Daniel and Rachel began tightening their hold, I had a direction that did not rely on their goodwill or my restraint. I did not need to confront them yet. I did not need to reveal anything. I needed to prepare, carefully and patiently, the way I had prepared budgets and plans my entire life. When they returned later that afternoon, I greeted them the same way I always had. My tone did not change. My expressions did not shift. If they noticed anything different, they did not say so. Inside, however, something fundamental had realigned. I was no longer reacting to pressure. I was planning around it. That night, as I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house, I felt something I had not felt in days. Not comfort, but certainty. I knew now that there was a way through what they were building. It would require patience, precision, and proof, but it existed. For the first time since the ground shifted beneath me, I understood that I was no longer standing alone. If you've stayed this far and want to see how it all ends, comment number 8 below. The final moves were already in place, and the truth was about to surface. Let's move on to the conclusion of this story. By the time everything came into the open, Daniel and Rachel believed they were nearing the finish line. I continued to appear cooperative, agreeing to sit down and review documents, listening as they explained procedures with a confidence that bordered on impatience. Their certainty was the clearest sign that they thought the outcome was already secured. They no longer measured their words as carefully. They assumed compliance. What they did not realize was that the foundation beneath their plan had already been documented. The conversations they held in the living room were no longer theoretical. They spoke openly about timelines, about what would happen once signatures were in place, about how much easier things would be after that. I did not interrupt. I did not challenge. I let the silence do its work while the record grew complete and undeniable. When my attorney arrived, the shift in the room was immediate. The calm authority of someone who did not belong to the family dynamic changed everything. What had been framed as concern was suddenly examined as control. What had been presented as assistance was identified as overreach. The difference was not emotional. It was legal. Daniel's confusion surfaced first. He looked between us, as if waiting for someone to explain how the ground had moved so suddenly beneath him. Rachel reacted differently. Her composure hardened into calculation, her posture defensive. She understood immediately that the story they had been telling no longer belonged to them. The facts were laid out carefully. My rights, my ownership. the absence of any legitimate authority over my decisions or property, the risk they had taken by acting as if consent could be manufactured through pressure. No raised voices, no accusations that needed embellishment. The evidence spoke without effort. In that moment, the roles we had been playing collapsed. Daniel was no longer the concerned son managing a situation. He was a man facing the consequences of assuming entitlement. Rachel was no longer the composed advisor guiding him. She was someone whose professional judgment was now under scrutiny, her choices exposed to people who would not excuse them. They left the house that afternoon without ceremony. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final exchange that needed to be remembered. The outcome did not require spectacle. It required distance and boundaries, clearly and permanently drawn. Legal steps followed, measured and deliberate, ensuring that what had been attempted could not be repeated. I did not feel victorious as the door closed behind them. Victory suggests competition. What I felt was resolution. The house returned to its quiet, not the fragile quiet of uncertainty, but the steady silence of ownership restored. The rooms felt larger again, as if they had been holding their breath. In the days that followed, I made decisions calmly. Safeguards were put in place. Authority was clarified. Relationships were redefined by fact rather than expectation. I did not seek punishment beyond protection. My goal had never been to destroy them. It had been to stop them. Their story ended not with anger, but with consequences. After everything ended, the house became quiet in a way I had not known for years. Not the tense quiet of waiting, not the cautious quiet of listening for footsteps, but a settled silence that felt earned. I woke when I wanted to wake. I moved through rooms without feeling observed. For the first time in a long while, the space belonged to me again, not just legally, but emotionally. Living alone returned its small rituals to me. Morning light on the kitchen counter, the sound of my own breathing at night, the comfort of choosing what to do with the day without explaining myself to anyone. None of it was dramatic, yet all of it felt profound. Peace, I learned, does not announce itself. It simply stays. I spent time looking back, not with bitterness, but with honesty. I thought about how easily love can blur boundaries, how responsibility can quietly turn into entitlement when it is never questioned. The betrayal did not begin with cruelty. It began with decisions made on my behalf, justified by concern, reinforced by familiarity. That is how control often enters a family, unnoticed until it has already taken root. What I learned too late, but learned fully, is that trust should never require the surrender of authority. Love does not demand silence. Care does not require obedience. Being a mother, even an aging one, does not mean relinquishing the right to be believed or the right to decide. Age does not erase competence. It only reveals who respects it. I think often of other women like me, mothers who have given decades of their lives to building homes, raising children, holding families together. Many of us were taught that endurance is virtue, that conflict is failure, that peace must be preserved at any cost. I would tell them now that preservation without protection is not peace. It is vulnerability. Listen to the small discomforts. Keep your documents where only you can reach them. Ask questions even when it feels awkward. Insist on understanding what you are asked to sign. These are not acts of distrust. They are acts of self-respect. No one who truly cares for you will ask you to give that up. I do not regret loving my son. I do not regret the years I spent believing in family above all else. Love was never my mistake. The mistake was believing that love alone could replace boundaries. Now, I carry both. Freedom came to me late, but it came clean. It did not arrive with triumph or revenge, but with clarity. I forgot to tell my son the camera was back on. What I remembered instead was myself. Some stories do not end with noise or victory, but with clarity. What began as trust slowly turned into a lesson about boundaries, power, and the quiet ways control can disguise itself as care. The heart of this journey is not betrayal alone, but awakening. It reminds us that dignity does not disappear with age, and wisdom does not come from silence, but from the courage to see clearly and act deliberately. Life has a way of testing what we believe about love, family, and loyalty. Sometimes protecting oneself is not an act of cruelty, but an act of survival. Strength is not always loud. Often, it is calm, patient, and deeply aware of its own worth. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it resonated with you, or if it stirred memories or thoughts of your own, feel free to share them in the comments. Your voice matters here. Please consider liking, subscribing, and following the channel for more stories that explore truth, resilience, and self-respect.